Hello and welcome back. Now that we have some familiarity with creating GUI applications, let's use Tkinter to create a client-side GUI to run for our chat room. In doing so, this is going to allow us to add a little more functionality to our program. Now, we will mainly be making improvements to the client side for now. In our next whole set of videos, we'll introduce a new library and make some adjustments on the server side. But for now, the server side is going to just be an exact copy of our last server script. So I'm going to copy that server script from our terminal-based chat room. So I'm going to open my file here. Nope, not in OneDrive. On my desktop. Here we are. So back in my terminal chat room, I'm going to open the server script, and I'm just going to do a quick file save as, and I'm going to save this in my basic GUI chat room example. So there's our server, so server side, and why don't I just, we'll just leave it. Everything can be left exactly the same here for right now. So now that the server is saved in there, that's perfect. So now let's open up a new file. So file, new file. We'll just make it a text file for right now, and I will save this into our basic GUI chat room, and I'll call it client.py. And here I got to give it the py extension because it's registering as plain text. Okay, perfect. So that's all set. So we're going to begin by working on the GUI layout using Tkinter. So why don't I put a comment up here? We'll just say client-side GUI chat room. All right, so we'll import Tkinter, and while we're here, we know we're going to need to use the socket and threading modules as well, so we might as well import them. So we'll import Tkinter, we'll import socket, and we'll import threading. All right, awesome. So now let's define our root window. So we'll come down here, we'll say define window. And so we're going to define the root window just like we had done before, and then we'll set some of its attributes. So we'll say root, our root window is we'll call the Tkinter module, and then we'll call the Tkinter class. And let's set the title, so root.title. We'll just call this chat client. So let's use that now to set our icon, root.icon bitmap, and we'll pass in message icon. And you do need to give the .ico extension here, I'm pretty sure, so .ico. Next, let's set the size of our chat window. So I'm going to do root.geometry. And I will make it a 600 by 600 window, and I don't want it to be resizable. So root.resizable, we'll pass in 0, 0 here. So you can't resize it in the X or in the Y. Awesome. So now why don't we define some colors and fonts? So we saw how we could adjust the fonts of my widgets before, right? We did it for our entry fields and our labels. But now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to declare a font to use for all stylings here, and then I will apply it to each widget when I want to use it. So let's define fonts and colors. So we'll say my font is going to be, it's a tuple. First is the font family, so I'm going to use Simsun. I like how it looks here, and I'm going to create a font size of 14. And then let's define some colors. We'll define two colors. I'll do black, which really, I mean, I could just do 0, 0, 0, 0, but I'll do 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, just so it's just, you can't even tell. You don't even be able to tell, but it'll be just, it'll be good for me. I like it better than just using all zeros, I guess. And then I'll do light green here, and we'll do, for light green, it'll be 1FC742. Okay, perfect. So now we've got our colors, and that's going to give us like an old school Apple computer vibe from the 1980s, I think, with the black and green. And then lastly, let's set the background color of our root window. So here's root, and we'll call the .config method on here, and we'll pass in the attribute background color, and we'll set it to be the black color that we had defined right here. And so, I mean, we can just change that later if we want to. If we can mess around with that. All right, so now I'm going to put some comments here for some spacing. So I'll say define functions, and then I'll say define GUI layout. All right, perfect. And the last thing that we have to do here is run the root window's main loop. So we'll say right at the bottom, if we want to actually see this window open, we'll say run the root window's main loop. Right, its main loop method is the thing that's going to open the window and keep it open. So root.main loop, we'll call that main loop method. And so if we run this right now, we should see our chat window open up. Hey, and there is going to be our chat client. So we got the icon loaded, that black screen, which is just slightly not black, if so perfect. All right, so now what are we going to do? Well, now let's think about the frames. We'll maybe define some frames here. So we're going to work on our GUI layout. We're going to have 3 frames in this app, essentially. So we're going to have 3 dedicated sections of specific functionality. First, we're going to have an information frame or an info frame where the user can enter in their name and they can enter in the IP and port address that they specifically want to connect to. Then we'll have an output frame that will display all of the messages from the the chat, and then we'll have an input frame where the user can then type in their own messages to send to the server. So we're going to stack these 3 frames on top of one another using the pack method. So we'll just have one frame on top of the other. So why don't we make these 3 frames right now? So I'll create an info frame. So info frame is equal to tkinter.frame. Where am I going to place this frame? I'm placing it in the root window, and I'm just going to set the background color to be my black color. Then I'm going to have an output frame next. All right, so output frame is going to be tkinter.frame. We're placing it in the root window, and the background color will be black. And then I'll have my input frame. All right, and it's tkinter.frame here, placing it in the root window, and the background color will be black. So let's just kind of visualize maybe what we're going for here. We're going to have at the top an information frame where the user can enter in their name, the IP address, and the port address they want to connect to, and probably a button that will say like connect. Right in here in the middle of the window will be the actual chat, so it'll be an output of all of the messages coming from the server. And then down here at the bottom, we'll have like a little input frame where maybe the user can enter in their text and then have a button to send it to the server to be broadcast. So that's kind of like how our frames are going to work. All right, perfect. So now that we have these frames, we'll pack each frame onto the screen. So we're going to use the pack method, and we'll only give the middle frame, the output frame, some vertical padding. So if you remember, our vertical padding we'll do on the top and bottom of this frame, so it'll kind of put some spacing between the info frame and output frame, and then the output frame and the input frame. So let's pack these right now. So we'll do info frame.pack, and we'll just no arguments here. So we'll do output frame.pack, and we'll set the vertical padding pad y to be 10, and then we'll do input frame.pack as well. So now our 3 frames should be packed on top of one another, so they'll just be layered up. And so if we look, we can't see anything yet, but that's not a problem because these frames haven't expanded. Remember, they're only going to get as big as the widgets inside of them unless we specify not to do that, which we're not doing right now. So not a problem. Let's actually go create some widgets, and then our frames will expand. So let's work on the info frame first. So why don't we put some I'll put another comment in here. I'll say create frames, and then I'll say info frame layout right here. So here's our info frame layout. So here in the information frame, the user needs to be able to enter in their name, an IP address, a port address, and then they need to be able to choose if they want to make a connection. So each of these data entries, like your name, your IP address, and your port address, are going to require an entry widget with an associated label widget so that the user knows what information to put where. And then lastly, we'll have some sort of button that will allow us to connect or disconnect. So let's see how this is going to work here. So I'm going to start by maybe making a label for their name. So I'll say name label is equal to a tkinter.label object. And inside of here, where are we going to attach this? We're going to attach this to, not the root window, we're going to attach it to the info frame. So we'll say info frame. Let's say the text here will be client name with a semicolon. The font is going to be my font, which is the font that we had previously defined right up here with our colors. Okay, so that's perfect. And then let's actually set some colors. So we'll set the foreground to be the light green color that we defined, and we'll set the background to be black. All right, so that'll just simply be a label that'll say client name, and then I'm going to put the entry box right next to it. So it'll, the user will know that this entry box is where they are supposed to enter in their name. So we'll say name entry is equal to tkinter.entry, an entry object. We're going to place this in the info frame. We don't want any text here, but we'll set the border width. So we're going to set the border width of this widget to be 3. So it'll be a thicker border, which I think will look nice. And then we'll set the font to be my font here. All right, so that's kind of like our name, but we got to do something similar for the IP address. So we'll do IP label is equal to tkinter.label, and we're going to place it in the info frame. The text of this label we'll say host IP with a colon. The font will be my font. The foreground will be light green, or the text color, right? And then the background will be black. All right, and so now we need an entry box for the IP address. So IP entry is equal to tkinter.entry. We'll place it in the info frame. The border width we'll set to 3 again, and the font will be my font. Perfect. And now let's just do something similar for the port address. So we'll say port label. We'll make a label for the port address. tkinter.label. We'll place it in the info frame. The text of our label will read port num. All right, port num. The font will be my font. The foreground or text color will be light green, and the background color will be black. And now we just have to create the entry for that port address. So we'll say port entry is equal to tkinter.entry. We're going to place this in the info frame. The border width here, border width will be consistent. We'll make it 3. And then the font here will be my font. All right, so that looks great. And now we need a button. We'll make a connect and a disconnect button. So we'll be able to connect to the server, and then if we want to leave, we'll be able to disconnect. So let's set some of those options right now. So we'll say connect button is equal to tkinter.button, and we'll put it in the info frame. And we'll say the text is going to say connect, and we'll set the font to be my font here. We'll set the foreground, or let's set the background color. We'll make our buttons be the light green color. I think that's going to look kind of cool. So we'll say the background color BG is our light green color, and then let's do a disconnect button as well. So we'll do disconnect button is equal to tkinter.button, and we'll add this to the info frame. The text will read disconnect, and the font will be my font, and the background color will be light green again. Now, we might have to do some work with setting the width of these things. Why don't we add, you know what, we're adding a border width to our entries. Why don't we add a border width to these colors, or these buttons too? Border width. Let's set it a little bit larger for the buttons. We'll make it like a border width of 5. I think that might look nice. So border width is equal to 5. Okay, so we've got all of our widgets for the info frame created. Now we just have to place them onto the screen. So we're going to do that using, we kind of want to have a very complicated layout here. So what we should probably use is the grid system. So we'll use the grid system to place them in here. So why don't we put them in right now? So we'll say name label .grid. So the name label is going to be in the first row, so we'll do row 0, and it'll be the first piece of information. So row 0, column 0, and we'll just put some pad X, I don't know, horizontal padding of 2 just to space it out, and then some vertical padding of, we'll say 10 here. And I'm going to copy this, and I'm just going to paste it 1 row below, because now instead of name label, I'm going to put the name entry. And we want this in row 0, but this time I want it in column 1, so it's just shifted 1 over. So if I run this right now, we should see the name label and the entry. Okay, client name and that. So that looks pretty good right there. Let's do the port label next. So really, I'm just going to paste this again. So let's do the we'll do the port next. Yeah, we'll do port next. So we'll do port label. We'll put this in row 0. We'll put it in column 2, and then we'll do the port entry. So port entry, and we'll put that in column 3. So if we run this, what's this going to look like for us? So we've got our client name, we've got our port number. This looks like it's a little bit too big here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hard code in, I think, a width to the port entry. So my port entry right here, I'm going to add a width attribute, and we'll just hard code it to be 10. All right, so now if we run that, that should resize it nicely. Okay, so that looks a lot better. We don't need that much space to write in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for our port number. So that looks pretty good. Now let's figure out where we want the IP address to go. I think I want the IP address to be below in the next row. So I'll say IP label.grid. Well, you know, I'm just going to paste this in because we'll do that, and I'll change name to IP label. All right, and so now I want it in the next row below. So I'm going to do row 1, column 0. And here in the second row, I'm going to have less vertical padding. Why don't I change it to, you know, pad Y to 5? Completely arbitrary, okay? I can't stress that enough. I'll copy this and paste it. It's just kind of, you know, you mess around with these values and see what you like. So then I'm going to put the entry box for the IP address. So this is going to be in the same row, but in the next column. So column 1 here. So now if we run this, let's take a look at what this looks like. Oh, that looks great. So I got my client name, host IP. I can type in the host IP. I've got my port number right here, which looks great. So now I need to just add the connect button and the disconnect button. So let's put those two things in. So I'll say connect button dot grid. We'll put it in row 1, column 2, and we'll give it some horizontal padding of 4 and pad Y of 5. And then we'll do the disconnect button as well. Disconnect button dot grid. We'll put it in the same row but in the next column. So column 3, pad X is equal to 4 and pad Y is equal to 5. So if I run this, I'm sure those buttons are not going to be a good set. Yeah, see, they look different. And the reason why they look different is because the button is going to be as big as needed for whatever text is inside of it. So I want these buttons to really be, I think, the same size. I think it would look a little bit better. So why don't I hard code their width? I'm going to hard code their width to be 10 as well. So my connect button, I'm going to come over here and I'll just say width is equal to 10. And my disconnect button, I'll add width is equal to 10 here. So now if we run this, let's see what happens. All right, that looks a lot better. I kind of like how these are all kind of roughly the same size. One of the things you might say is, okay, when the program starts, we should be able to connect. So I got to enter in some information. I should be able to hit the connect button. But I shouldn't be able to hit the disconnect button unless a valid connection has been made. So I sort of want to like disable the disconnect button at startup, which is really easy to do. There's a keyword that we can use to do that. It's the disconnect keyword. I just have to bring it into the program. So I'm going to import that. So I'm going to come up here to the top and I'm going to say from Tkinter import the disabled. It's the disabled keyword. So I'm going to disable that. So we'll import disabled. And then I'm just going to scroll down here and where I have my disconnect button, where I declare it, right here, I'm just going to use that disabled keyword on the state attribute. So I'll say state is equal to disabled. And so that's going to disable that nicely for me right here. So let's test this out now. All right, and you can see that the disconnect button is disabled upon startup, and what we will then have to do is just, enable it or make it active at some given point here. Okay, so our layout is beginning to look pretty nice here. I think it's looking great. It's got some really good potential. I think this is a good place to stop. In our next video, we'll continue building out this layout for our chat client. So I'll see you then. Hello and welcome back. In our last video, we began filling out the layout for the client-side chat GUI here. So we populated our information frame, right? So we could type in like our name, we could type in our IP, the IP address we want to connect to, 192.168.1. I don't know, 18, and then the port address we want to connect to, and then we should be able to hit connect, and then hopefully we will connect to a server that is at this location listening for incoming connections. So in this video, why don't we work on our output frames, which is essentially going to be like the chat window that hosts all of the communication, and then our input frame where the user is going to be able to type some information into the server. Now, the output frame is going to contain some new widgets that we haven't yet talked about. So it's going to contain something called a list box, which will hold a list of items, each individual item being a message that was then sent to the server. And it will hold a scroll bar so the client can scroll through the list box to read the given messages. So let's start by creating the scroll bar. Now, to do so, we're going to use the scroll bar class, which is part of Tkinter. And we're going to place it in the output frame. And when we do that, we have to set the orientation of the scroll bar to either be a vertical scroll bar like this, or sometimes you'll see horizontal scroll bars like this. So we have to specify which one we want to use. Well, we're going to use a vertical scroll bar so we can scroll up and down through the chat. And so we're going to bring in a keyword that will help us specify that. We'll bring in the vertical keyword here. Okay, great. So now why don't I scroll down to my layout section. So here's my layout section. We got our info frame layout. So now I'll just say output frame layout. And I'm going to create a scroll bar now. So I'll call it my scroll bar, and I'll set it equal to tkinter.scroll bar. So we'll call the scroll bar class. Okay, so now where do we want to place this scroll bar? We want to place it in the output frame. So output frame, and we are going to set the orient attribute to the vertical keyword that we brought in. So that's going to make it a vertical scroll bar for us. Okay, so now why don't I next create the list box, right? So we'll now create the list box that's going to, hold all of our messages. So we've got our scroll bar. Let's create our list box, my list box, and I will set this equal to tkinter.listbox. And where are we going to put it? We're going to put it in the output frame. All right, so output frame. And then I'll set some of the attributes here. And again, a lot of these attributes are like trial and error, so I just don't know the values that we need for these things. A lot of them I am testing ahead of time. Okay, so let's see. Let's set some of these. So we'll say we need a height. We'll set a height of the list box. So height is equal to 20. We'll set a width so that their set size is equal to 55. We'll set a border width of, say, 3. We'll set a background color of black. We'll set a foreground color of light green. And we'll set a font. So the font that we'll use is my font. All right, perfect. And so now there's probably one more thing we have to, I think, set here. We somehow have to attach the scroll bar that we had created to the list box, right? So like right now when I move this scroll bar, the scroll bar knows to essentially move this widget of information. So this is kind of like a two-step process. It's a twofold step. First, we'll tell the list box to associate with the scroll bar using the Y scroll command attribute. So then, once we've done that, so this will set the attribute from the scroll bar. Then we'll use the config method on the scroll bar and set a command, just like we would do with a button press. So when the user clicks and moves the scroll bar, kind of like this, we want to adjust the list box vertical view. All right, so let's see how we are essentially going to do that. So inside of my list box, I'm going to come over here and set one more attribute. We're going to set the Y scroll command, and we'll set the Y scroll command to be my scroll bar, which is the scroll bar we created, and we'll call .set. All right, so that will set the scroll bar into the list box, but then we said that there is a second thing we have to do here, and we will call my scroll bar .config, and we will set a command just like we did with our buttons, right? So when we press a button, we wanted it to run a certain function. When we press and move the scroll bar, what do we want to do? We want to call my list box Y view. All right, so that will set the vertical view when we move our scroll bar. And so I think that that's going to work out really quite nicely for us. So now if we look, why don't we place these objects into our output frame? And so let's use the grid system to do this. So we'll say my list box .grid. So I'll set this to be row 0, column 0, right? It's going to be the first thing in this frame. And then I want the scroll bar to sort of be right to the side of it, right? So you know how the scroll bar is sort of stuck over here onto the right. So we'll say my scroll bar .grid. So we'll do row 0, column 1. So column 1, it'll be right next to it. So if we run this, hopefully I will see, hey, I see my list box, which is great. So here's my list box. It's going to hold all of my information. But then my scroll bar is a really teeny scroll bar, right? It's here, but it's not great. So really, we want to expand this scroll bar. Now we saw when using the pack system, we could use the fill attribute and the expand attribute to grow a widget into its dedicated space. When we use the grid system, we can't do that. Instead, we have something else. It's called the sticky system. So sticky tells the widget what to do if the cell is larger than the widget. And so by default, the widget is centered into this cell, right, into the frame. Sticky basically takes in a compass direction, whether it's north, south, east, or west, and then expands the widget in those directions. So if you think about it, we want to expand this scroll bar vertically, so we're going to set the sticky attribute to north and south. So let's look over here. So I'm going to close this out. And I'm going to come over here to my scroll bar, and we're now going to say, hey, let's use the sticky attribute and set sticky to north, south, so NS. And so now if I run this, hopefully that scroll bar will have been expanded. Hey, and it's perfect. So it's really nice here. And as this populates and the chat fills up, we should be able to scroll through that chat. We can't test it right now because we don't have anything in there, but we can test it later on once we get some of the functionality to see if our command right here and then our Y scroll command is set correctly. I think it is, but we'll test it later. Okay, so now the output frame is done. Why don't we do our input frame? We'll just finish our frames here. So we'll say input frame layout. And so for our input frame, we're going to need an entry for a message that the client wants to send, and then a button to send this message. So like our earlier button, we're not going to want to be able to send a message unless we have a valid connection. So we're going to disable the send button on startup. So let's go ahead and write those right now. So we'll create an input entry. And I don't think we need a label here for the message. I think the user is going to know that they are supposed to type in their message here. So we'll say tkinter.entry, and we'll have an input frame. We're going to put it in the input frame. I'll hard code a width to be 45. Again, this was guess and check on my part. We'll set a border width to be 3 for consistency and styling, and then we'll set the font to be my font. Awesome. And let's create a send button now. So send button is equal to tkinter.button. We'll call the button class. We're going to put that button in the input frame. The text on here will say send. The border width, I think we were using a border width of 5 for our buttons, and we hard-coded a width of 10 for our buttons. The font will be my font. And do we need anything else? Let's think about this for a second. Oh yeah, let's set the background color of the button to be the bright or light green. So BG is that light green color we had defined. And then I'm going to set this state to be disabled upon startup. So you can't actually click this button until we make a connection. And now that I have those, I need to put them into the frame. So I will use the grid layout here because I don't want these stacked on top of each other. I want them side by side. So let's do input entry.grid, and we'll do row 0, column 0, and then we'll just do some horizontal padding of 5 and vertical padding of 5 too, just to space them out a bit. And then our send button, we'll call the grid method, and we'll do row 0. This will be column 1, so it's right to the right of it. And then we'll do pad x. Pad x is 5. Pad y is also 5. Okay, I think that's going to complete our layout here. Let's test this and see what it looks like. Yeah, so that looks pretty great. Again, I knew the widths to be 45 and 10. I picked those. I tested them ahead of time. So you might just have to debug them or test them if you're building this, something like this on your own. So the layout looks great. I think it looks pretty cool. Why don't we quickly outline some of our required functions here that we're going to use, and then we'll end the video. So I'll close out of the layout, and let's go up to the little region where I have our functions here. And so if we think about it, we are going to need... what are we going to need? Well, we're going to need a connect function to connect to our server. So we'll come in here and we'll just write the signatures out here. So def connect, and we'll put a doc string here. We'll say connect to a server at a given IP and port address. And then I'll just say pass for right now. We're going to want to have something, a function that's going to verify our connection and passes like any initially required information, kind of like our name to the server. So you remember before we had like the name flag, and we had that step where the name flag was sent, and then we had to send our name over. We'll do something similar here where we verify our connection. So we'll have def verify connection. All right, and we'll just simply say verify that the server connection is valid and pass required information. All right, and that'll be a pass here for right now. We're going to want a disconnect function, right? If we can connect, we should be able to disconnect from the server. So def disconnect. All right, and we'll say disconnect from the server, and we'll pass for right now. We're going to want the ability to send a message to our server, so we'll say def send message. All right, and we'll say send a message to the server to be broadcast. Right, we're going to broadcast that message to everyone, and we'll say pass. And then we also need to be able to receive incoming messages from the server, so we'll say def receive message, and we'll just put a doc string here, receive an incoming message from the server, and we'll pass there. All right, I really think that is probably all of the functionality that we need. And so in our next video, what we'll do is we'll begin to take the GUI layout that we built, and we'll map out some of this functionality that we have here, and then tie in kind of like our buttons and all that other great stuff. So we'll start that in our next video. I can't wait to see you then. Hello and welcome back. With our GUI completed, we can now focus on the functionality of our program. So to begin, let's define some constants that will be used for our socket connection, kind of like we had done before in the past. So I'm going to put them right here above where we are defining our functions. So we'll say define socket constants. Now, what we're going to need here, we're not going to need to specify, we're not going to hard code our IP address or our port address, because the client is going to be able to type them into our the GUI. So what we will do is we'll define our encoder and our byte size just like before. So we'll say encoder is equal to UTF-8, and we'll say byte size Again, we're not going to worry about our maximum byte size for right now. We'll approach that later on. So we'll have those two things here. Now, there's another thing that we have to do. We need a way to create a socket object inside of our connect function, right? So inside of this connect function, you can imagine the user is going to type in the information, their IP, their port address, and then they're going to hit connect, and we're going to run this connect function. And inside of here, we have to make a socket connection. But that socket connection, if we make it inside of this function, is only going to exist locally inside of this function. And we're going to probably want to have access to it in a lot of these different functions that we have down here. So there's a few ways that we can handle this. And I think the easiest way, and it's what we'll start with right here, we'll start with the easiest method, is to use a global variable. Now let's define, we'll define it right here. We'll say global client socket. Now, some people might say that this is a really bad idea. I think for our case, only having one global variable, it's not too bad to keep track of, but you definitely should be hesitant to use global variables, and you most certainly shouldn't have lots of them all over your code. It can lead to a lot of headaches in the future. I think for this it's okay. In our next iteration of this application, where we add some more complexities to it, we'll see how we can move away from using global variables by writing a class for our socket connection and then creating instances of that class. So for right now, this is going to be pretty great. So we'll have declared client socket as a global variable, which means that if we use it inside of one of these functions, every function will have access to the global variable that we've created here. So that's exactly what we want. So with these variables defined, let's go right to our connect method. Let's start writing our connect method first. So the first thing that we're going to have to do is we'll have to declare our global variable client socket. This way, any changes we make to the variable client socket inside of this function will be made to the global variable, which exists outside of the function itself. So we'll declare global client socket. So essentially this says like, hey, we're going to have a variable which we should be able to alter from inside various functions, and then this says, hey, we want to vary. We want to change this variable. Okay, perfect. So now, once we have that, let's think about what we have to do. Inside of here, we have to get all of the required information from our entries. We have to, let's do that right now. So like our IP address, the name, and the port, we have to get all that stuff. So we'll say get the required connection information. All right, so these are all entry boxes, and we know that entries have the get method where we can get the text that is inside of them. So we'll say name is equal to name entry.get. We'll say IP is equal to IP entry.get, and we'll say port is equal to port entry.get. All right, awesome. Now let's walk through, and we'll say if and only if all three of these entries have values in them, then we should try to make a connection, right? If someone left the IP field blank, there's no point in trying to make the connection. So we're going to use an if statement here. So we'll say only try to make a connection if all three fields are filled in. So we'll say if name and IP and port. So essentially it just means like if they're not empty, right? So if this has something in it, and this has something in it, and this has something in it, then this will evaluate to true, and we can go ahead and run this conditional statement here. So now we have verified that these three fields have information in them. So why don't we maybe put like a verification in, right? There's a verification here. So let's give some visual feedback to the client, and so we'll put a status message into our list box, right? So in the output, the output frame. So we'll say, okay, to do that, we'll say conditions for connection are met, try for connection. Okay, so we'll say my list box dot insert. So we're going to insert something into the list box. So that's how a list box works. It has an insert method where you can put something into that list box. And so we're going to specify the index that we want to insert at. So we'll say index 0 right at the top. And then what do we want to insert in? I'm going to use an F string. and I'll say name is waiting to connect to, we'll put the IP address at port address. So just a little bit of visual confirmation that should appear here for us. Okay, perfect. So now that we have that, let's try to go ahead and create our client socket. And so we're going to create this client socket using IPv4 and TCP. So we'll come down here and we'll say create a socket. Well, I will say client socket to connect to the server. All right, so we'll say client socket is equal to socket.socket, and in here we'll pass socket.afinet, there's IPv4, and then we'll say socket.sockstream, there's TCP. All right, so once we have that, let's now make our connection. So we'll say client socket.connect. And where do we want to connect to? Well, it's got to be a tuple. We're going to connect to the IP address that we got from our field, and then we're also going to connect to the port address. There's only one problem here. That port address, when we call the get method on an entry field, this is going to be a string. So I'm just going to cast it to an integer to be our port address. And that's what we have to do here. We have to make sure that that port address is an integer. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. So now that we have our socket trying to connect, we should essentially verify the connection. Luckily for us, we have a function that's going to do that. We have a verify connection function. So let's call that right now. So we'll say verify that the connection is valid. So we'll call verify connection. And in here, in our verify connection function, let's pass in the client's name, as we know that that's something that the server will want to know, right? We said that, before we pass like that name flag. So we're going to pass in the name here. And so that means in my signature for verify connection, I need to be taking in a name. Okay, great. So what happens if we don't have sufficient information, right? So like we've got it, okay, if they filled in all these forms, but we should have something that sets whether or not they didn't do it. So we'll have an else statement here, and we'll just say conditions for connection were not met, and we'll simply put something into the list box again. So we'll say my list box dot insert. We'll insert it at the front, so 0. F. Well, I don't think I need an F string for this. I'll just use a string. Insufficient information for connection. ... Okay, so that looks pretty good. That looks pretty good. Now, if we want to test this out, we need to go to our connect button, right? So we've got this connect function. We have to link it to our button. So I'm going to scroll down here to my connect button, and we are going to add at the end the command attribute. Command is equal to connect. So now that button is linked to the connect function. Perfect. If we test this, let's just see. If we test this, this should maybe work. So if I hit connect, it says insufficient information. So if I put some stuff in here, 192.168.1.7 at 12345, and I hit connect, it says, okay, so we're getting, you could see that it sort of hung there, but it says Mike is waiting to connect at 192.168.1.7 at our port, so that's working great. The reason why is because I don't have anything, I don't have a server running at this connection or this port. So that's good. One last thing here, I want to delete all of the previous items here in my list box. When I make the connection, okay? So when we connect, I want to delete anything else that has been in here. So we can do that by calling the delete method of the list box. So I'm going to do that right at the top of my connects function. So the first thing that we're going to do if we're connecting to a new connection is I want to get rid of anything that was in the list box from like a previous chat. So right at the top of my connect function, I'll say clear any previous chats. And so I'll call my list box dot delete, and I want to start at the beginning of the list box, index 0, and I want to go all the way to the end of the list box. So we'll put the end keyword in here, and that just means we have to import that end keyword right here. All right, perfect. So I think that the connect function is going to work out pretty good. So hold on 1 second here. Okay, so let's just test this. So if I run this now, you can see if I connect, insufficient connection, and then when I put some stuff in here, it cleared it out. Okay, so now we've got a new connection here, so that's working really nice. Okay, so now when we try to make a connection, we're calling our verify connection function. So we have to verify that the connection is valid. So if you recall, the first thing that our server is going to do once we connect to it, so if I come back over to the server script that we just copied, where is it? Connect client. The first thing that it's going to do is try to get the client's name, right? So we send this name flag here. So in our verify connection function, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to check for this flag and then send the name and get the verification that in fact we have actually connected. So you can see it right here. So let's come over here to our verify connection function. And the first thing that we're going to do is we have to declare our client socket as a global variable again. So we'll say global client socket. And now let's check, let's get a flag from the server, right? We know we're sending a flag over, so we'll say, here we'll put a comment, the server will send a name flag if a valid connection is made. Okay, so let's get that flag. So we'll say flag, oops, my cursor jumped. We'll say flag is equal to, so we need to get information, receive information from our socket. So we'll do client socket.receive, RECV. Maximum size is our byte size, and then we'll decode it. Decode using our encoder that we had specified. Okay, so now we have that flag. Let's check to see if that flag is the word name. So we'll now say if flag is equal to name. Well, what do we want to do? Well, we'll put a comment here. We'll say the connection was made, send client name, and await verification. All right, so let's send our name over. So we'll say client socket.send our name. All right, and the name we've passed in, right? We got the name in our connect function from our entry box, and then we've passed it into this function. But we need to encode it, so we'll do name.encode encoder. And then let's go back over to our server and see what's going to happen next. So on our server, they are waiting to get the client name, and once we get the client name, they get added to our two appropriate lists, and then the client sends some stuff back to the server, right? No, I'm sorry, the server sends something back to the client. The server says, hey, client, you have connected. So we should wait for that verification message. So we'll say message is equal to client socket.receive. So we're going to receive something from the server again, byte size, and then we'll call the .decode method, or .decode on this, and pass in our encoder. All right, awesome. So now what are we going to do? So let's look to see if we actually get this message. So if this message comes through, then that's awesome. So we'll say if message, we'll say server sent a verification, connection is valid. All right, so our connection is valid now. So let's add that message to our list box, right? It was like going to say, hey, you've connected, congratulations. So we'll do my list box dot insert. And what are we going to insert into the list box? Well, we want to insert it at index 0. We'll insert it right at the top, and then we'll insert the given message. All right, so now that the connection is valid, we should probably change the states of our buttons, right? So we had like our disconnect button was disabled and our send message button was disabled initially, but now we have a connection, so we should be able to use those things. And we really shouldn't be able to make another connection, right? If we're connected, we shouldn't connect again, so we should disable our connect button. So let's change the button/entry states. And so we've already used the disabled keyword, but now we're going to add another keyword here. We're going to add the normal keyword, and that will make the buttons and entries essentially active. So let's come back down here. We're changing our states. So first we'll change the connect button. So we'll say connect button.config. We'll use the config method here and to change the state, and we're going to disable the connect button. So once you're connected, you can't connect again. And then let's do the same for the disconnect button.config. State is equal to normal. So now you should be able to disconnect if you want to. And then we'll do the send button .config. So we should be able to send a message. So that state will be normal. All right, and then let's also disable the entry field. So once you've sent your information, and you shouldn't be able to change your name, IP, or port address unless you disconnect. So we'll say name entry .config, state is equal to disabled, IP entry .config, state is equal to disabled, and then lastly port entry .config, state is equal to disabled. Awesome. So I think this is going to work out pretty good. So now, if we think about it, the last thing that we want to do, the connection is valid. We've sent all our information. We've updated our GUI. Now that we have a valid connection, we should make a thread. And we should begin to constantly look if we can receive messages that are coming in from the server. So, right, we want to be able to always get information from the server. So that's going to be a thread that we're going to run. So now we'll say create a thread to continuously receive messages from the server. So we're going to call this receive thread, and we'll call threading threading.thread. So we'll make a new thread, and what's our target going to be? Our target is going to be this receive message function that we have not yet written. So we'll say target is receive message. And then let's start the thread. So we'll say receive thread.start. Okay, so that looks pretty good. One of the last things that we should do is let's finish this up by maybe writing an else block. If for some reason the confirmation message from the server never comes in, what do we want to do? Well, let's give a verification message that the server, wasn't responding, and then we'll like update our list box and close the socket. So we'll come over here and we'll say, okay, an else block here in line with our if statement, checking for the verification message. So we'll say here, no verification message was received. All right, and so we'll create a new list box entry. So my list box.insert, and we'll insert this. We'll insert this at the end because it's like an error message. We'll say connection not verified. Goodbye. ... All right, so that looks pretty good. And then let's just close our socket. So we'll say client socket.close. And then let's also do a similar thing here if the name flag wasn't sent. So we're just kind of like covering our bases here. So now I'll have an else statement in line with that statement. And here we'll just say no name flag was sent. Connection was refused, maybe. Connection was refused. And so here we'll say we'll put another thing into the list box, my list box.insert. We'll insert it at the end as an error message, connection refused. Goodbye. ... And we will close our client socket.close. Okay, so perfect. I think this is coming along nicely. Let's actually test this out. So I'm going to run my server so we can actually test this and have something that we connect to. So my server is running, and so now I'm going to run my client. All right, so I'll say if I try to click connect, insufficient connection, I'll put my name in here. I'll put my IP, 192.168.1.7. That's my local IP. And then my port, let's put the wrong port, 12344. And if I hit connect, All right, it says Mike is waiting. I did not get the error message on that, so I'll have to figure that out. What if I put 12345 in? It says, Mike, you have connected to the server, so that is great. So we'll have to look at why that error message is not coming through. I'm going to pause the video and try to figure that out quick. Okay, so I figured it out. The issue was we weren't looking at the right error. So imagine, right, our if and else statements are whether or not the flag has come in or our verification message was sent. So, for example, if I change the flag, here's my if statement, if the flag is name. On my server side, if I change the flag to, I don't know, namey, right, and now I run this, and I run my client, now we'll see that else block being run. So if I put in Mike and 192.168.1.7 and 12345 as my port, you can see it says connection was refused, goodbye. So that's working, I think, the way that we want it to. Why don't I go back and change that flag back to name. Okay, perfect. I think, what do I want to do? I'm going to... Let's change the error messages from being at the end. Let's put them right at the beginning. So we'll do 0 and 0. I think that'll just look a little bit nicer, a little bit more consistent. Okay, perfect. So this seems like everything is working out nicely. I think this is a great place to stop, and we'll continue writing some more of these functions in our next video. So I will see you then. Hello and welcome back. Let's just take a quick look at where we are at after our last video. So if I run my server and I run my client window will pop open as a GUI, and I have the ability to put in my name, Mike, my IP 192.168.1.7, and then my desired port address. And when I click connect, it says we are waiting to connect, and we have connected to the server. So we've got that verification. There's a nice mechanism going on between the server sending a name flag to the client getting that flag, and then sending the appropriate information over. So there's kind of like a nice back and forth saying that, hey, we have a connection. And if you notice, my entry fields have been disabled, my connect button has been disabled, send is active, and disconnect is active now. So we have a way to connect to our server, so let's quickly discuss how we are going to disconnect from the server. So we'll stop those processes. Okay, perfect. So for now, what we're going to do is we'll simply have the client essentially sever the connection. They will just close on their end, and that will be that. Later, we'll see that we'll maybe need some mechanism in place to verify the disconnect on both the client and the server side. But for right now, we don't really need that. So we're just going to make things as easy as possible for right now. So we're going to declare our global client socket variable in our disconnect function. So let's come down here to our disconnect function. All right, so here's disconnect. We'll say global client socket, so we can make some changes here. And the first thing that we'll do is we'll just close the socket. So we'll say close the socket. So client socket dot close. Awesome. So now that the socket's been closed, right, what we should do is we should update all of the states of our buttons. So I'm going to actually just copy this from where we did it earlier. Where did we do it earlier? Right here in the verify connection. I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to paste it right in here. I'll just realign these things. And essentially, wherever we have disabled, I want to change that to normal. So I'm going to use Alt and click and have multiple cursors. So wherever it said disabled, I'm going to change this to normal. And then wherever we had normal, I will change it to disabled. So the send and disconnect button, we will disable those. Okay, so I think that that's going to work pretty good. So with this function essentially written, right, we're just severing the socket and then updating the states of our buttons and entries. We now have to link this function to our disconnect button. So we'll do that with the command attribute. So I'm going to scroll down here. I'm going to be on my disconnect button, and we'll come over here and we'll say command is equal to disconnect. Okay. That should work. So let's just run it right now and see what happens. So I'll run the server. We'll run the client. Mike 192.168. 1.7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We connect. I should be able to disconnect. All right, I've disconnected. Let's just change our name. Bob. Connect, and Bob has been connected. And then let's just look at what the server sees. Good, so the server is getting those two connections, right? We connected with Mike, and then we connected with Bob. So the connecting and disconnecting to our server is working out quite nicely. So now let's take care of sending messages to the server. So we've got a function here, send messages. So we want to be able to send the message that we want to the server. And so we'll start here by declaring our global client socket so we know where we're sending it. And then we'll simply say send the message to the server. Okay, so how are we going to do that? Well, the message is going to be in one of our entry fields. It's the entry field that we called right here, our input entry. So we got to get the text from that entry. All right, not too bad. We can do that. So we'll say message is equal to input entry dot get. We'll call the dot get method. And now that we have that, let's send it over to the server via our client socket. So I'll say client socket dot send message, and I need to encode it. So I'll say dot encode encoder, and we'll use the default encoder. Once I send the message, what I'm going to want to do is I want to essentially clear the entry field. So I'm going to clear the input entry so I don't have to manually delete that. So we'll say input entry dot delete. We'll start at index 0 and go all the way to the end. Okay, great. So now we just have to link the send message function to our send button. So we'll scroll down here to our layout. Here is our send button, and let's link it via the command attribute to send message. All right. The last thing that we need to sort of do here is write our receive message function. So let's scroll back up. What are we going to do when we receive a message? Well, we have to declare our global client socket so we know where we're going to be receiving the message from. So global client socket. And now we'll want to receive our message like at all times, right? So we're running this inside of a thread. If you recall, when we verify that the connection has been made, we are starting a thread to receive all of our messages. And so we want this thread to just run forever until there's an error, like the client has left. So we're going to run this in an infinite while loop. So we'll say while true. And now we'll use a try except block to handle this. So we'll say try. We'll put a comment here, receive an incoming message from the server. So we'll say message is equal to client socket.receive, RECV, and we'll specify the byte size, dot decode. We got to decode that message using our specified encoder. And now that we have the message, let's put it into our list box. So we'll say my list box dot insert. So this will make it appear in the chat. At index 0, we'll right at the beginning, and then we'll put our message. All right, so now what do we do if that's not going to work? So we'll say accept. And here we'll just say an error occurred. Disconnect from the server. So we'll put something into the list box. We'll say my list box dot insert. At index 0, we'll say closing the connection. Goodbye. And let's call our disconnect method, right? We know we have a method that is going to take care of disconnecting us. So if an error has occurred, we're then going to call the disconnect method. So it'll close the socket and it'll update all of the changes to our GUI. So I think that's going to work pretty nice. So we'll say disconnect. And now here, once we've disconnected, we want to break out of this infinite while loop. So we'll put a break statement here. Okay, so let's test this out right now. So let's see. I'm just going to work on some of my spacing here. That looks good. Looks good. Got way too many spaces there. Okay, that looks good. That looks good. Okay, so let's see if this works. Now our server, right? We didn't really change our server at all, but what's our server doing? Our server is doing exactly what we want it to do. When our server starts, we're running connect client, which is going to run in an infinite while loop, It's listening for every connection. So it's accepting every connection, and when it accepts it, it passes along the name flag, which we're handling on the client side. And then if the name comes in correctly, we are updating the server, or updating the client, right? We're saying, hey, you've connected to the server. And then we're starting a thread to receive incoming messages from that specific client. And that thread just runs forever as long as the client is available. And once the client's not available, we break out of that thread. So I think that this should work pretty nice for us. So let's run this. All right, and so now let's run a couple of things here. All right, I'll run another one. Let's just see. So we've got two GUIs here. We'll connect Mike 192.168.1.7 at port 12345. We have connected. All right, and then let's do Bob 192.168.1.7 at 12345. We'll connect. You might have a different IP address, right? You should look up your own IP address. So we'll say, hey, Bob. And it is working, sort of. Hey, Mike, what's up? But it's weird, right? We've got these weird text characters. And if you think about it, we have to go back and clean up our server a little bit because we were using those ANSI escape characters to give our terminal some like added color flair. And those don't translate into the GUI, right? Those are only for terminal use. So we gotta remove those. So let's go clean that up actually. So I'm gonna close all of this. All right, we'll close this out. Delete. And come back over to my server. And so where were we doing those? So if we look right here in receive message, I'm going to get rid of my ANSI escape characters. I'm also going to get rid of the tab, and I'll get rid of that right there. All right, so that looks good. And then I think we had one for when they were leaving. So we'll get rid of that, including the tab, and then I'll get rid of this. Okay, so if I save this now, I think that this will work a lot better. So why don't we just test this again, and we'll test every single feature that's available to us in the program. So the server is running. Great. Let's run the client. We'll run a couple of versions of this client and see what happens. So there's 1. There's 2. And maybe we'll run 3 for good measure. All right, so I got 3 different versions of the client. We'll move them around here a little bit. Perfect. And where's the other one? Nope, it was this one. There we go. Okay, so let's connect. We'll say Mike at 192.168.1.7 at port 12345. We'll connect. Here we'll say Bob at 192.168.1.7 at port 12345. We'll connect. And here we'll say Mary at 192.168.1.7 at port 12345, and we'll connect. And so if we look at our server, what's our server saying? Our server is saying that, hey, we got these 3 connections. They're all coming from different ports, but everything's in. So that's great. So now let's test some of these features. So I'll minimize that. We'll just test the chat. So we'll say, hey, everyone. So Mike is going to send this message to the server. It's going to broadcast it. Everybody gets it. Cool. We can say, neat. Bob can do that. Awesome. We'll say, Mary will say, I have to leave. Goodbye. And so we'll hit send. And now Mary's going to hit disconnect. So closing the connection, goodbye. That says Mary has left the chat. Mary has left the chat, so that looks pretty good. And then if Mary wants to reconnect, she can connect again. It says Mary has joined the chat, and it cleared out the old chat. Mary has joined the chat. So that looks like everything is working pretty nicely here. And it's kind of got a cool little, I think, theme stylistically to it. It looks pretty neat. There are a few shortcomings to this, though. First, I would like somehow to differentiate one client from another client within my chat window. Right now, everything is just like that, light green color. In our last program, we were able to incorporate kind of different colors, right? When someone left, we had a red font color. If Mary left the chat, that would be red. We don't have that here. So one way that we could differentiate one user from the next and kind of add a little bit more flair to this is to introduce colors to the font. So every user might have a specific color that they want. Now, this becomes an interesting problem because now instead of simply passing a string to the server, like the message that we want, what we will be passing is some more complicated data, the string and the color of the string. So we currently don't have a way to send more complicated packets of information. But no worries, we will figure that out. We're going to get there. Another shortcoming is that most chat rooms have like an administrator that can do things like warn a user, kick a user, or ban inappropriate users. And right now, our server is still limited to like our it's still here in our terminal application where we don't have a GUI for the server. But if we make a GUI for the server, we can treat whoever is hosting the server as the admin and then give them the ability to sort of oversee the chat. And so in order to accomplish these goals, we'll have to introduce some new modules to help us, and that's exactly what we'll begin to do in our next set of videos. So I look forward to seeing you then.